Hello and welcome to Off Track, the motorcycle racing podcast. I'm your host as always, Dave Neal, and what an absolute pleasure. Ladies and gentlemen, former Honda Britain, Rothmans Honda rider, senior TT winner from 86, if I've done my homework right. Ladies and gentlemen, Roger BURNETT. Roger, great to see you. Thank you for inviting us up to such a wonderful place at Laceby Manor.
Thank you. It's great how technology's moved on and we're able to do a podcast. And we were just discussing earlier, how in the old days of Grand Prix racing, when the journalists had to make all the tapes, get the photography done and fly it back to get into MCN ready for Wednesday morning. But times have changed dramatically. Haven't they?
Just with the advent of electronic, and I'm just making sure that we've got everything all plugged in and everything's going a little bit. I think we're doing all right with this. But yeah, this is fantastic. You've got a fantastic place here at Laceby as well, and there's a Lincolnshireman born and bred. This is home for you.
Yeah, I mean, I come from a big family, 2 brothers, 2 sisters. My dad was a truck driver, and so we weren't privileged in any way. We were loved. We were kept clean and taught right from wrong. Got a clip round the ear when we needed one. But brought up in a small village just outside of where we are now. And there was this, I'm just explaining how I got into bikes. Absolutely. There was this great guy called Chris Mayhew, who then was a novice racer. And for me, I was fascinated by the sound of this bike being warmed up after being rebuilt in the village. And it was there was no silencers on TZs in those days, and it was actually a TD2. So I was fascinated, went along to find out what was going on, and then subsequently spent most of my evenings in his garage with him, polishing the spokes with Solvol Autosol on his TD2, and he had the cleanest bike on the grid. And then after a grammar school education, disappointingly for my parents, I left school at 16 and went to work in the motorbike shop that Chris Mayhew was running. It was in Grimsby. It was a dealership, a Yamaha dealership. Derek Chatterton was the owner, another famous Lincolnshire rider, the king of Cadwell, Derek Chatterton. And so that was my background and how I really got into bikes. So as a mechanic, I got to road test. As a road tester of a customer's bike, I got to technically, unofficially, race against the other mechanics that were out road testing at the same time. In fact, we got banned in the end that we couldn't road test at the same time. But one of those mechanics was a very good motorcyclist called Kevin Stowe. Kevin Stowe was great. He was at that point an amateur, started club racing, and he ended up winning the Northwest 200. And in 1979 at the Northwest 200, had an horrific crash down the University Straight with Frank Kennedy, Warren Willing. There was a few of them involved in the crash. Kevin, his bike had fuel starvation problems had caused him to have to retire. But he toured on the side of the road on the straight, and they were slipstreaming. And you know what it's like at the Northwest 200. It's so tight down those straights. Even though there's straights, they're not straights. There's kinks. And somebody pulled out the slipstream, came across him, hit the back of him, and the rest is history. But it ended Kevin's career. And Kevin was an incredible rider. He was in 78. I was his mechanic. And he was one of the early riders that could drift a TZ 750 around Gerrard's at Mallory Park with the dust coming off the fairing, and people were in awe of his talent. Really, he was great, but that wasn't to be. So that left me in a position where Kevin's career was ended. I'd always been a fan of Roger Marshall's. My whole family were fans of Roger Marshall. And we used to go and travel all over the country to follow him. I remember in 1978, we went to Brands Hatch. And before we got to Brands Hatch, we saw this blue transit van parked on the side of the road, and it was Roger Marshall and Don Briggs in the Transit going to Brands Hatch, and they'd broken down. So my dad quickly got a tow rope on the van, and we towed him into Brands Hatch, where they managed to get the van repaired over the course of the weekend. And I can't even remember then if it was 1 or 2 day race meetings. It was almost like it was probably one day.
It happened a lot back then, didn't it? It wasn't you turn up on a Thursday as it is now, and Friday, Saturday, Sunday. People were working during the week, and Saturday and Sunday were the race meetings.
That's it. So I seem to think that was a race day that we towed him in, and then you still had to do scrutineering and all the things, even though it was probably the Powerbike International even. It was a big event. So because we'd followed Roger, and I had this relationship with Kevin at Chatterton's because I worked with him, and that naturally fitted me into mechanicking for Kevin on his race bikes. And he had an RG500, a TZ 750 and a TZ 350. So it was a lot of work on top of your work day, but naturally then I migrated towards wanting to mechanic for Roger Marshall, and Roger and I had been friends since the mid-70s. He used to come and pick me up from the village that I lived in before I could drive to take me to races. And I remember going to the Northwest 200 with him, and my mum saying to him, "You will look after him, Roger, won't you?" And he said, "Don't you worry, Val. I'll make sure he keeps his fluids up." So you know what that meant.
I know exactly what that meant. What a great place to do it.
So we've been friends for a long time. Of course, then me and my brother Ian, we put our backs into helping Roger Marshall. Roger was transitioning from being with Don Briggs, and Don was amazing as an engineer, but probably as a motivator wasn't quite there. My brother and I, got Roger really kind of fired up and focused on understanding how good he was and what he could achieve. He would tell you himself that we did a great job of elevating him into to the front of British motorcycle racing. I mean, he did it, but you do need help. And Roger's now giving that help to people like Ryan Vickers, and he'd done it with Jason O'Halloran and so on. So that it does work. And we actually helped him a lot, and that got him his factory ride with Suzuki. Murawaki first.
Yes.
With Wayne Gardner, and then on to Suzuki. And then when he migrated onto the Murawaki, I had an opportunity to go and work with the team which were based in London. But my dad said, "No, you're not going. You've got to finish your City and Guilds at Grimsby College," which was annoying. So I kind of braked off, and then I thought, right, well, maybe it's time for me to have a go. I knew the technical part inside and out. And I kind of had hung about at races long enough to understand what it was about. So that's when I decided it was time for me to have a go.
And where did you first end up when you first started racing? I mean, one thing I must say, as you can see at the top here, I have the name Kevin Stowe written at the top, because that's a nod from Phil Mayhew.
Okay.
I spoke to Phil's a good friend of mine.
Okay.
And he knew that I was coming to chat with you, and he said, "Make sure you ask about Kevin Stowe."
Yeah.
So Phil, we've covered Kevin Stowe for you without a doubt, and I know how much regard you hold his dad Chris in as well, which fantastic, man. That's a whole different podcast.
Yeah, sure.
With Chris Mayhew,
sure.
Isn't it? Of what he's achieved through the time.
Yeah.
But when I look at my notes over here, where did it start for you initially in motorcycle racing as a rider?
So whilst I was working with Roger Marshall, Cadwell afternoon was always a test day. Thursday afternoon during the week was a test day at Cadwell, should I say. And occasionally he would let me run if we had some pistons to run in or something, and he didn't want to ride around for 20 laps running pistons in, he would say, "Go and ride it round and run the pistons in." I remember specifically one day, he'd been actually on the bike first, and I went out on it. And when I braked, there was a juddering from the headstock. So I quickly came in and I said, "Did you not notice the juddering from the headstock?" And he said, "No." I said, "Oh, anyway, the headstock was loose, technically. For some reason, we must have had the fork yokes out, and it had bedded in him riding it, and we needed to tighten that back up." But I'm just explaining, there was a feeling that I had for a mechanical feeling that I think was an important thing for a motorcycle racer to understand that. So that was kind of how I'd gone around a track, if you like, but that's not anything to boast around. So I thought, right, well, I'm going to start racing. How am I going to get a bike? No money. Where am I going to get a bike from? So I rang Mal Carter, Alan Carter's father. And I said to Mal, "It's Roger Burnett speaking." I said, "I don't know if you can help me, but I'd like a TZ350 because I want to start racing." So he started laughing on the phone. Does it matter if I swear?
Not at all.
So he
Especially
said,
not when Mal's concerned.
No, and this is exactly what Mal said, and you could not get away with saying this these days, but I'm going to tell you exactly what he said, because we're talking about 1981. So he said, he laughed at me and he said, "That little wanker of mine," which was Alan, and he sponsored an African lad. And so he said, "That little wanker of mine and the soap dodger will be at Cadwell on Thursday afternoon." And he said, if you come and get round in under 1:05, you can take a TZ350 home.
Wow.
That's what he said. I said, "Right, thank you." So I went, got round under 1:05, and true to his word, "There's a TZ350, let me take it home." He knew, obviously, I'd got a mechanical background, so I was going to be able to mechanic the bike properly. It ran in the Faro Yamaha colours. I was club racing. I was up and running. He gave me a white trailer with the bike. And I had the Faro Yamaha leathers, Faro garage leathers. And Alan was already racing. And Alan was everything you didn't want to be in terms of his behaviour in the paddock. So he would lead you into loads of problems with Jim Parker and all the people that ran the club races in those days. You know, "Will Roger Burnett and Alan Carter please come to race control?" And you'd been cheating because you'd been out in the wrong practice session, or, you know, you can imagine. So I thought, no, I don't want to do that. I want to do this properly. I don't want to try and cheat the system. I want to try and work with it. So I didn't have a bad first year as a novice, newcomer to Cadwell and things. And then because of a previous relationship with Harold Coppock, who had sponsored Kevin Stowe and was a renowned sponsor in the sport in those days, an amazing man. Most of his family worked in BSB and some still do. Annabelle was Harold Coppock's granddaughter, who's only just retired from starting the races.
Flag lady, yeah.
Yeah. So Annabelle was Harold Coppock's granddaughter. And most of the family were in the pit lane in some guise or another. And Harold called me and said, You've had a great first year. And I said, "Well, it's just starting out." And he said, "No, it's not gone bad." He said, "I've got a local person to me that's got a 250 Rotax and a TZ350, and he's looking for a rider. Would you be interested in riding these bikes?" He said, "I don't know. You'd have to figure out what you'd have to pay for, but there'll be some way of doing it, I'm sure." So I said, "Thanks, Harold." This guy was called Peter Harding, and he had haulage in Carterton. No, not Carterton. That's where Harold lived. He lived at Bourton in the Water.
It's all in the same neck of the woods.
All same neck of the woods.
Because Carterton's just outside Bryce Norton.
Is it?
My old stomping ground.
Oh, right. So Peter Harding Transport had these bikes. He'd had a guy riding them the year before that had won the North Gloucester Championship. There was a guy from Devizes called Roy Kennedy, who was the man to beat, if you like. Trevor Nation was in that North Gloucestershire club scene at the time, and several other people, and even Nigel Snook.
Really?
Nigel Snook was on the grid as well.
From FS3 Racing.
Yeah, Nigel Snook, the owner of FS3, was also on the grid at the same time. So I went and rode this Rotax and this 350, won both of the championships, the 250 and the 350 championship for North Gloucestershire Club that year. But the difficulty was, whilst it was a great opportunity, every weekend I had to travel to Bourton-on-the-Water on a Friday night to go with Peter Harding and the bikes on a Saturday to the race, or the Sunday, whichever it was. And it was, even though we would be going, let's say, to Mallory, I couldn't meet him at Mallory. His rules were I had to go and travel with him. So it was kind of a bit restricting and tiring. Not that I didn't have the energy to do it.
It's not an easy place to get to from here.
No, and Pete Harding himself, his pleasure was actually mechanicking the bikes. And actually, no disrespect, but I could have done a better job.
Fair enough.
And there was things that were causing issues that we didn't need to have technically. So I thought, for the next year I had to rethink it a bit. And a local company helped me to get a TZ350. Sid Smaller, who you'll perhaps remember, he's died now, but Sid Smaller, he rode a TZ700, TZ750 as it developed into, and he still had that bike and he let me have it. And so I had and George Beale gave me a 250. So I had a 250, 350 and 750, which was far too many bikes to look after. And that quickly became a 350, basically. And then I was able to win national races, at Cadwell and all over the country, which was great. It was a great season. So then that was that year. And the next year I decided that I wanted to be the best. I wanted to do World Championship racing. So I decided the best thing to do was to learn the international tracks, but also learn it on the bike that I wanted to end up riding, which was a 500. In those days, that was the Grand Prix bike to have. So I managed to get a company called Anglo Marine locally, who were a shipping company local to here, that bought me Stu Avant's Mark 7 Suzuki, which was a fabulous bike. And Stu Avant looked after it well. It was a nicely prepared bike. So I got that, went to Suzuki to have classes on building an RG500 engine with Martin Ogborn. And the boys down at Suzuki taught me how to build a 500 properly. And those classes were amazing, so I was the engine builder for my own engine and mechanic for my own bike. And I decided to do the European Championship. And I mixed in with some British racing. So the first race was a national at Cadwell Park with Steve Parrish and quite a few good riders doing this first national. And first time out I won. I beat them. So that was a good start to the season. I went off to do the European Championship races, finished third in the European Championship. There was a guy that was difficult to beat who'd done it for several years called Eero Haivarinen, the Finnish rider, who was great, learnt a lot from him. But we were doing tracks like Imatra, Czech Brno, but on the road track. So amazing. I feel so privileged to have raced on those tracks. I know that they're dangerous. I understand all of those things. But that was such a thrill that you couldn't even replicate that by going to Mallory Park, for example. No. It's not even in the same ballpark. I saw recently that Pete Hickman had been to Imatra. And I'm really looking forward to catching up with him because I want to know what the track was like that he was on and how he found it and so on, So I did the European Championship. First race was Jarama, Madrid. I remember going on my own with a van and caravan, getting there, getting the caravan hooked up to electric and boiling the kettle. Most people thought for a cup of tea, but not for me. I needed hot water. I wanted to wash the van and caravan and make everything sparkle. So then I had a little tent, a little kind of gazebo that I put up that I worked out of. Changed all my own tyres, mechanic the bike, everything, and finished on a podium. So that was the first one.
Could you imagine that happening these days?
No.
It's not.
And
even
I was
close,
24. I was 24. So it's not very old.
No, but for a first European season on a bike that you prepared to go off to Harama, which later we did GP, it's still part of the GP circus at that point, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was.
To go and do that must have given you so much pride to sit there. And, were you able to be in the moment enough to understand what you'd achieved at that point? Or were you constantly looking for the next, where am I going next, the next step onwards?
I had no idea what I was achieving. I just had a focus to get to the top. And I knew that 500 Grand Prix bike, although it's a production bike, 500 Grand Prix bike on international tracks was the route. And the structure was great because the FIM had the Grand Prix, but they also had the European Championship. And you were on a grading list then. It was called the grading list. And if you were on the grading list, it gave you the opportunity to enter. So you couldn't just enter, you had to have achieved a certain level. But it was a great stepping stone, and not many people did it. There were other British riders that did it, and in that year there was a rider from Kent called Gary Lingham who did it at the same year, which was great to have other Brits around you. Gary was a bit older than me, a bit more experienced, but and of course then I went and did the British races, and so I went to Oliver's Mount, which was amazing, with my 500, and qualified pole position in front of Barry Sheene and Rob Mack. So, and Barry Sheene came to me and said, Lodger, he said, we're going to make a race of it, because it was push starts in those days.
Yeah.
And he said, if you get a good start, wait for me. And if I get a good start, I'll wait for you. And we'll make a great race of it. And then we'll just last few laps, see who's... So that's how it was, But anyway, that kind of freaked me out because I didn't really know Barry Sheene. For him to come and talk to me like that, of course, it was push start and I fluffed the start. And he never waited. But I think I still got through to third. But it was great. And then it was the MCN Championship. I can't remember exactly what it was called, but it was an MCN back series because, of course, MCN was the big media source in those days. So it was great. Now, what that did do, though, because technically I'd complied with Barry's request, he called me later that year. My mum answered the phone. There's no mobile phones or anything in those days.
On the house phone.
Mum, comes in and says, Roger, there's Barry Sheene on the phone. And I said, nah, come on, it's somebody pulling your leg. It was, and he says, Roger, you're doing great. I want to give you the chance of riding my bike at the Power Bike International at Brands Hatch.
Wow.
So, wow.
That's incredible.
So I'd gone from a paper round with a paper bag with Barry Sheene on it, because he was my hero, delivering newspapers, pretending I was Barry Sheene, falling off so many times off my push bike, leaning over too far, to then him actually asking me to race his bike,
How incredible. I mean, that's almost affirmation that you are doing something right in the sport. If Barry Sheene, the two-time world champion, can say, I'd like you to ride my bike. He's not going to do that for just anybody. So that was the point where you came onto the radar of Rob Mack, and obviously Reg would know what you were doing at that point as well. But for Barry Sheene to do that, was that then the platform to take you on to Grand Prix racing as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, so all that time, Roger Marshall had supported me. I remember him standing on the track at the top of the mountain after I'd won a 350 race at Cadwell, cheering, which was nice. But what this race at Brands Hatch did was it got better because Barry did commentary, and it was live on Grandstand, which then we got terrestrial television for bike racing, which was incredible. And Barry Sheene did so much for us all in that respect. So it was live on Grandstand. I don't know, 6 million viewers probably. he was doing commentary and I was riding his bike. It couldn't have been set up better. Anyway, long story short, I finished second and got the fastest lap, which was amazing. I did better than he thought I was going to do. But he said, the minute I came down the pit lane, you then went in your garage. There was no parc ferme or anything like that. You went in your garage, and then the first three went to a podium celebration. So I went in the garage, and he closed the garage door, and he said, listen, he said, when I open that door, the media's going to be asking you about the bike and the ride, and you've done great. Remember, the bike's really slow, but it handles well, right? Because he had been riding it in Grand Prix, and whether it had been fast enough or not, it was like a missile to me. It was like sitting on a rocket compared to my production RG 500. So I got to ride that bike, which was an amazing feeling, to ride that bike. And that race, I was on Michelin tyres. I'd never ridden on Michelin tyres. I was on a 16-inch front wheel. I'd never had a 16-inch front wheel because I was on Dunlops on a 17-inch or 18-inch front wheel. So there was a lot to get used to in a short space of time. But the grip level I had was unbelievable. I could feel the grip. It was just fantastic. And we were on the short circuit at Brands, and after Bottom Bend and then into the left right before Clearways, I can't remember what it's called, I could pass anybody up the inside there. And I just passed somebody every lap until I got nearly to the front. Wayne Gardner won the race.
Well, did it? On the Honda Britain?
On the Honda Britain bike, yeah. Roger Marshall was in the hunt with me. Rob Mack. I passed Rob Mack on the last lap, I remember. So it was all good. It was all great. And that gave me the opportunity to have an offer from both Honda and Suzuki for the future.
Which did you choose and why?
I chose wrongly.
Really?
Yeah. I chose Honda. And I don't say that with not disrespectfully in any way. But I think the great thing about Honda at that time, they had Barry Simmons as a team manager. And Barry Simmons was incredible. Love him or hate him, and most people didn't like him. He was strict, he was to the point, and he got the best out of you. And Honda went racing then to win, and we knew that. I did ask Barry his advice, and Barry's advice was to go Honda. But bear in mind, he'd always been Suzuki. He'd seen the other side and maybe thought the grass was greener himself. Thinking about the way Suzuki were, they were so much more family orientated. Rex White was incredible as the team manager in those days. And the people, that got the Suzuki job in the end was Kenny Irons, who unfortunately we lost at Cadwell Park.
I remember.
And then came along Kevin Schwantz. Now, I think I would have been teamed up with Kevin Schwantz, and I didn't know, but they were going Grand Prix racing. And they were going Grand Prix racing, but they weren't Grand Prix racing as an official team at the time. I didn't know that, so that was hindsight. Honda, we had a year in British Championship. Roger Marshall won, I was second. And then 86, I won. He was second. I won the TT, but I did Grand Prix that year as well. And actually, there was not many riders. Rob Mack could boast this, but not many could, that could win a TT, win a British Championship, and be on the front row of the grid at a Grand Prix. And that's what I was able to do, and finish in the top 8 at Grand Prix racing, as well as those other things. And that is not possible these days because of the way the bikes are and the formula. But it was just so amazing to be able to be that rounded rider that could do the roads and win, British Championship win, and fight, because you had to fight in the British Championship, as you do now, and actually go and hone your skills with a finesse of riding at somewhere like Silverstone and being on the front row of the grid. Assen, I did Spa. Kenny Roberts came to me at Spa in 1986. He walked in the garage and he said, "Who's this guy riding this bike?" Obviously it was me. So I said, "It's me." He said, "How many times have you raced here?" Looked at me straight in the eye. "How many times have you raced here?" And I said, "I've never been here before." He said, "You're on the same part of the track, the right part of the track, every lap, every corner." I was on the front row. I was like 6th fastest amongst the established guys. So it was fantastic. I really gelled well with that the NS 500, there's the RS and the NS 500. I really gelled well with it. I had a great crew chief, a guy called Doug Holtham, who had been with Neil Mackenzie with the Armstrong days, and Doug knew his way around and worked hard to get the bike right, which was fantastic. The team were great in general. I mean, Chris Mayer was part of the team, which ironically came around again. Chris was part of the Honda team then. I was teammate to my great friend Roger Marshall, and that was difficult for him because I go from him picking me up and my mum getting him to look after me and him keeping my fluids up to me able to become his teammate and then beat him. So it was quite an extraordinary journey through all of that emotion, if you can imagine. And not easy for him either because, Roger's fiercely competitive. He's a strong guy. He was always a strong guy mentally on the track. I've got so much respect for how he went about his racing. If I could have had a bit more maybe of that in me, that could have been even better for me. So that's where we ended up. And then, of course, Honda Britain disbanded at the end of 1986, which left everybody out of a job except me, luckily, because Rothmans took me on as their camera bike almost in Grand Prix. And I rode the NS 500 that was the year old, the 4-cylinder, but the dated bike was 87. There was a brand new bike which Wayne Gardner won on. So I'm riding the older bike. But hey, you look at the results. I was in the top 10 in every Grand Prix, which wasn't bad. Somebody said I finished in the top 10 in every Grand Prix that I started. It's not bad in that year,
Not when you look at the rivals that you were with.
Yeah, and
Rob
on a
Mack
year
was
old,
out there
and on
Eddie
a
Lawson.
dated bike. Oh, the factory bikes on the grid was unbelievable. I mean, unfortunately for me that year, unfortunately for Neil Mackenzie, he got the 87 bike in the HB colours with Irv Kanemoto. I mean, how amazing was that for him and good for him? And he made the most of it by qualifying pole position at Suzuka, the first race in Japan. And that was, we'd always been coming up the ranks together and I'd always kind of been a bit ahead of him. And it was at that point that he got ahead of me and I never caught him up after that. That was, that was it. And then there was Rob Mack on the factory Yamaha, Ron Haslam on the Honda with Elf.
On the Elf Honda, yeah.
On the Elf Honda. So there were 4 Brits in it that were in the top 10, which was great. We can't get a Brit on the grid at the moment in
so
MotoGP.
So difficult now compared to how it was, as you say, in those days when the great British riders of the time had factory rides. Neil was coming through the ranks. Ron was the statesman of the championships. He'd been there. He ended up with the Pepsi Suzuki ride. Rob Mack ended up on a Pepsi Suzuki as well, didn't he, at one point? Yeah. And the cabin Honda.
Yeah.
But
it was so funny.
Sorry, Karen.
No,
go for it.
No, so it's so funny because, I think back to Leon Haslam, for example. And Tony Mang was a great friend of mine. And Colette, his wife, actually schooled Leon. She gave him tuition lessons, proper school lessons, because she was a school teacher at the Grand Prix paddock because he wasn't going to school because he was with his dad. Leon was with his dad and his mum. And Colette gave him education, lessons. Courage. Isn't that amazing? And Leon then, after school, technically, or in the late afternoons and evenings, I'd get this knock on my motorhome door, and it was Leon to see if I was playing. He coming out to play.
It's incredible how you watch what Leon's doing now and the career that Leon's had through Grand Prix and through World Superbikes, and now still at the forefront of British Superbikes. And is he just turned 40?
40.
He's 40 now.
And he's brilliant this year. I've got so much respect for him and the family, the whole family. Anne's amazing. Anne is amazing. Let's not.
She's the glue, isn't she?
None of them, including Leon, would be where they are without Anne. Anne's been amazing. And Ron technically is incredible. And Leon just keeps doing it. And, at the minute, he's one of the top riders in BSB. And there's no question that if he went if he had a World Superbike opportunity, he'd be a top 10 in World Superbikes as well.
Absolutely, on the right kit, without a shadow of a doubt. And we'll come on to that. Sure, I know we'll keep an eye on the time because you have an appointment elsewhere later. Yeah. But we'll come on to that shortly. What's your favourite memory of being in both the Rothmans Honda Britain team and the factory team as well, amongst all those names and the British riders, when you look back?
When I look back, Rothmans were an incredible ingredient. Nobody before or after has ever given motorcycle racing the same leg up that Rothmans gave it. We, as riders, the first thing we were sent to do was to go to Savile Row in London to be measured for our blazer, our trousers and our shirts and our ties. Now, that sounds like, my God, why would you want to do that? But tell me a football team that doesn't travel in looking smart and representing their sport in an amazing way. And they all do. And you'd think of footballers not to dress like that, but they do. Right. Just recently, we've got Wimbledon on at the moment, and I saw Robbie Fowler and one of the other top golfers dressed amazingly smart, representing themselves. So I'm all for that. That's what made me a bit different in the early days. Not everybody liked it, but that was me. I mean, of course, they nicknamed me Hairnet, not Burnett, because they thought I was just too interesting what I looked like. But I wasn't. I just wanted to represent what we were doing in the right way. So we got measured for our Savile Row suits. We went to Rothmans International to be groomed by the media on what to say and what not to say. Anti-tobacco legislation was coming in at the time. But, you know, we were getting funding into our sport from an international brand, which was absolutely incredible. And I was all for it. And we learnt as an industry a lot from the intervention of Rothmans. And I thank them to this day for what they did for the sport. And bear in mind, they sat in Grand Prix, British, and in Formula One. So they were doing it all at the same time with Damon Hill driving in F1 at the time. So no, it was incredible. We learnt a lot. Snooker they were involved in at the time as well, Rothman. So we cross over. So we were taking motorcycling to snooker, and snooker was coming to motorcycling. So we were crossing over with the media, which was great. And I think, and I'll go on to finish your question, but answer your question. Sorry, I talk a lot.
Not a problem.
Sorry, I talk a lot. But
this is about you. It's your show.
The thing that now everybody thinks social media is amazing. I think it's a disaster. I think the instant news that people can get might be convenient for everybody, but it's a total disaster in terms of the value of what you've got to say, because it drips out and dribbles out, and everybody's got access. When we were working and they made Rothmans made a statement or MotoGP made a statement, it was really respected and everybody was on the edge of the seat waiting for that news. Now it's just a bit too instant. It's a bit too out there. And how do you value it?
But everybody's got a voice as well, haven't they?
Everybody's got a voice. So,
not always the right voice,
not
but
always.
Everybody's got a voice.
Yeah. And I think just to finish the question, the relationship of the riders, Joey Dunlop, what a legend. Spent a lot of time with Joey Dunlop as a teammate, not as much as Roger Marshall did, and Roger Marshall was a fierce rival to Joey, and Roger was just brilliant, but Joey always had the edge just on the roads at the wrong time, and Roger got the bad luck. I'll never forget a head gasket going at Zolder on Roger's bike when he was faster than Joey and Joey wins, and there was always a reason, but that's how it goes, But the teammates we had, Wayne Gardner came over from Australia in 1980, 81, riding the Murawaki, 81 it was, riding the Murawaki. My mum did his washing and ironing. That's the truth.
I believe it.
He stayed at our house a lot. And then I remember him saying, guess what? I'm earning £100 a day. I'm earning £100 a day riding for Honda. And that was a lot of money to be, for him, like a lazy Aussie doing nothing, which he was. But then, Wayne became a very jealous person in terms of not wanting you to be better than him. Typical Aussie, we just watch the Ashes. It's the same thing. It's instilled into them.
It is.
You can't really criticize them for it. It's just in their DNA. So he didn't like it when you get going up the ladder and you're kind of on the same grid as him. He wasn't very helpful, I'll be honest. Whereas Roger Marshall was always helpful. But no, we had some great teammates and learnt a lot. Learnt a lot that makes you able to go into your next life and next career, I think.
Which is a great lead into the question of what was the biggest thing that you learned during that time that's taken you forward?
Always doing the right thing. I think competition it's not about cheating. It's about winning fairly. I don't like bullies at all. I could tell you that there's too many bullies in racing now. Some that are bullies on the track, some that are bullies off the track, but we won't go into that. But what did I learn? I learned to value the moment, to appreciate what other people do for you. And then when you've got through all of that, you're able to then reflect, look back at what you did wrong. And I made loads of mistakes, absolutely loads of mistakes. But then thereafter, then I tried to help other people not make those mistakes and won world championships with those riders as a result.
I find it really interesting when people can be in the moment for important times, because that's why I asked the question about Harama, because when you're younger, everything's going on around you. It's very difficult to be in that moment. And when you look back and you're like, I really wish I'd enjoyed that more. But you can only bring that in from the more seasoned pros that you were riding with at the time, which I guess has then set you up for the successful businessman that you've become after racing.
Yeah, I think what I learned was that I didn't work hard enough. I'll be dead honest with you. I think that I didn't have anybody to push me. My brother was great, a great support to me, Ian. And I held him back because he wanted to start racing again, and he did in the end. And then I missed him when I didn't have him after I'd started to ride for Honda and so on, because he pushed me along and would push me along and had my best interests at heart, which I always knew. So I missed that, which made me lazy. Now, I'm not a lazy person, although if you're allowed to be, I think we all can be. And so when I reflected back on what I could have done versus what I did, I actually realized I'd only scratched the surface. So when I went on to a secondary career, if you like, or in business, because racing doesn't last forever, I've just worked my socks off ever since. And I really mean that. Unsociable hours, whatever it took to do what it takes. Made sacrifices in that respect because family life didn't come first. And, you hear so many people talk about family life and family, and I get that, but I didn't have time for that. I didn't have time to make that a priority. I remember when my wife had Alex, my son, my dad went to pick her up to bring her out of hospital. I was busy, which doesn't sound great, but it's all right if you're trying to put the bread on the table, somebody's got to do it. So I worked really hard, and then you get momentum by working really hard in business, and you don't see the benefit in the beginning, but in the end you do. So that's been my philosophy, really. I've had a lot of good fun with the riders that we had and managed through the marketing business, RBP. And it's been some great times, some great success Neil Hodgson, World Superbike champion, British champion. I had a team in Grand Prix for 3 years, Team Burnett, 94, 95, 93, 94, 95. We ran a 500 with Neil on it. Neil crashed once at the IRTA test at Jerez, and he never crashed for the whole season, not in a practice or a race. And for the final race in Argentina, he was on the front row of the grid with Mick Doohan, Luca Cadalora and Daryl Beattie as a 19-year-old lad. And guess what? Could not keep him in the paddock. There wasn't a ride. He was British and there was no ride.
Nothing there for him at all.
At 19 and he's on the front row. Never crashed all year. Imagine that now. That would be amazing, wouldn't it?
Dorna would love that, I think, at this point, especially for the British audience.
Wouldn't that be amazing? So that was when Neil had to divert back to Superbike, took Foggy's ride at Ducati. Foggy went to Honda. And, you know the story of Neil thereafter. But 2003, he won the World Championship, which was a huge success. I think winning the British Championship in 2000 was massive, and winning the World Superbike race as a rookie, as a wild card, was fantastic. Of course, Chris Walker had bad luck that year, and he was probably the crowd favourite at the time during that battle and that duel.
2000 was an incredible season. Yeah. Season of two halves, wasn't it?
Season of two halves. But that then talking about people in the sport, Colin Wright was an incredible team manager. I liken him to Paul Curran, who is an amazing team manager. I've got an interest in Ryan Vickers, as you know. Ryan, I love him to bits. He's a very, very appreciative lad. Anything you do for him is great. And he's ultra talented. I mean, he's starting to show that now. But he's starting to show it, interestingly, with Roger Marshall by his side and Paul Curran, a strong team manager and somebody with the amount of experience that Roger's got to mentor and help him along. So that combination's great.
I don't think Paul gets the plaudits he deserves for running the OMG racing team, because he's under the radar so often. He's not a public face. He doesn't stand at the front of the garage. He's in the back. He's watching everything. I had the pleasure of working with him for 2 seasons, as you know, and he was fantastic to work with. And I think for what he does for the riders, what he did for Brad and Kyle last year, and what he's doing for Kyle and for Ryan this year, especially with the Yamaha setup. The BMW was difficult because of the machinery that they had. It was difficult for everybody. But the switch to Yamaha has really brought the team to the fore and shown just exactly what Paul, along with the support of Holly, his other half, of what they can do with that team, and Al Gardner as well. I'm a big fan of what they do.
Oh, me too. I was very appreciative that they took Ryan on this year. Ryan's had, not everybody could understand what Ryan needed or what he'd been through, and everybody in the paddock had him down as a failure, which is great when you bounce back from that and show everybody that they're wrong. So many people making decisions in the paddock. I've probably forgotten more about racing than they'll ever know. And I don't mean that from a cocky point of view. I just mean it. And if I pick a rider that I think can win, I do it for a reason. I don't do it because I've got an ego and I want to have a rider by my side. I do it because I just genuinely believe, and then I get behind. And Ryan's been that rider. We had, through our stable, if you like, we've had Tom Sykes, which we got on the road to success with World Superbike. I remember him wanting to leave Kawasaki, and if he had, he wouldn't have won a World Championship, but persuaded him it was the right place for him. Riders get excited about what they should and shouldn't be doing and what they need and they just need to get on with it sometimes. Danny Kent's won a World Championship. Well, Danny Kent wouldn't have been on the grid if it hadn't been for me getting him the funding that he needed to be on the grid. And the person in question has been a supporter. 2 guys have been supporters of all the riders that I've been with and from my beginnings is Joe Henderson, and his brand is called Attis Insurance now, which is synonymous with motorsport, and also a guy called Phil Bergen, who's got a group of care homes called MMCG. They've both been amazing, and they've supported all the riders that we've worked with. And it was Phil Bergen that put up the cash for Danny Kent to be in the Aki Ayo team. And then leading on from that, he won the World Championship with the Leopard, and then he got tugged away by the people within Leopard into some false management business and all that rubbish that goes in the MotoGP paddock. That they buy somebody a watch and that's it. I think the rider thinks, my God, this guy's amazing. He's just bought me a watch. But anyway, and helped Johnny Ray a lot. James, of course, was incredible. James Toseland. And Sam. And Sam, through the pandemic, I wasn't able to go to races, and I didn't feel it was appropriate to try to keep working for Sam when I couldn't be at the track. And, Marina is embedded in the business, and it was natural. She's bossy anyway. It was natural that she could just pick up where, and Sam was embedded in VDS. Yes. So at that point, and so it was natural just to step back a bit. And it suited me because I was trying to build this business and build the spa and the gym and all the things I've done here. So that's it, really.
I spoke to Neil last week. I told him I was coming up to see you. And he mentioned something about Ken Dodd.
Ah.
Is it by all accounts? Well, you tell the story. What's the story of Ken Dodd and airports?
Well, Neil always managed to go through an airport and he was very frugal about his luggage, and he would always end up with a carrier bag in his hand. And at the time, Ken Dodd had all his money in carrier bags. Do you remember? Under his bed.
Under his bed.
Yeah. And so Neil always said, I've got my Ken Dodd. That was his carrier bag. And he always had one with really strong handles. Yeah.
He also credited you, and he told me the story about the time when Neil signed for Dantin Ducati. And you were instrumental in making the contract with the factory, not the team. And he said that basically saved his career financially because of your foresight in that deal.
Well, Neil knows that whatever I did, and any rider that I've worked with, I would only ever do it in their best interests. I was not in rider management for me. I was in it for them. And if I'd been in it for me, I'd have had 20 all at the same time, like the managers in MotoGP do now. Carlo Panat and all those guys have got multiple riders. But I always said, if I'm standing on the side of the track, I want one rider in that race to win. I don't want options. I want one. So that was the difference about how so I didn't set out as a business of rider management. Maybe I should. That's another story. But I didn't. So when it came to Neil's, there was a lot going on. And it was hard because Darrell Healy and GSE Racing had been amazing. And they'd branched out into world superbike racing when you could. And I say that you could because the rules were the same as British.
Yeah.
And for me, I'd be the first person to stick my hand up and say, the rules for British should be the same as world. Then there's a transition. But as it is, it probably suits BSB to keep the riders and the teams nicely in the paddock with no opportunity to stray outside of the paddock because of the rule.
Difficult to come in, difficult to leave.
Exactly. But then you could. And GSE made that leap of faith with James Toseland and Neil, which was fantastic. And because they'd been so good, let's not forget in 2002, Neil was giving Colin Edwards and Bayliss a run on what was deemed to be a lesser bike. But the team were amazing, GSE, and Colin Wright, once again, got the most out of the guys. What I'm trying to say is that getting Neil away from that team and into the factory team wasn't easy because the GSE team wanted to keep him. So I had to negotiate behind the scenes with Ducati to get them to make the decision. So it was not my decision, not Neil's decision. So there was a lot more going on than there appeared to be on the surface. And then the contract that I negotiated for Neil gave him a payment if he won the championship for the following year. So, of course, he won in 2003. So his fee for 2004 was a very high one. But it was like, you got to know the business, and that was the business at the time. But the problem was the market had gone down. Ducati didn't want to invest that much in a World Superbike rider, and Pirelli were just coming in 2004. It was the first year. Michelin were going out, and Ducati didn't know where they stood. And they didn't want to invest so heavily. They'd got the MotoGP project in the background coming along, so their budget was shuffled. So Paolo Ciabatti, we had a meeting, and Paolo said, look, these are the circumstances, but what I'd like to do, if you agree, if you don't agree, we've got to go down the road of staying in World Superbike, and we'll have to pay Neil. But there's an opportunity in MotoGP. If Neil wants to take it, it's with a satellite team that we're running with Louis Dantin. And I said, the only way that we will consider that is if the contract stays with you and you pay. So they didn't want to do that, Ducati. They said, no, he'll pay. I said, I don't care. If you think he'll pay, you say you'll pay, because he'll pay you then, if that's the way you want to do it. So I stuck to my guns and kept the contract with Ducati. And of course, Dantin didn't pay.
No.
He didn't pay. But then it took a long time, because technically that was a debt to Ducati. So Ducati had to inherit that debt before Ducati could legally pay Neil, but he got paid.
The last line of his message when we spoke last week was, "I owe my career to that man," which I thought was just a wonderful thing to say, and a real admiration for what you've done for his career. And he doesn't say that lightly.
No, I mean, well, if you go back to 92, his dad came to see me with Neil, and Neil was a 16-year-old lad sat on a sofa and didn't say a thing, and his dad said everything, which Mark did talk a lot. I don't know if he still does, but he did. And we got Neil out in 1992, and Stuart Med supported him. Stuart Med was a great guy, supported him. Neil ended up winning the 125 British Championship, and I think he got 4-lap records that year, 92. 92, yeah, pink wheels. So guess what? 93, I said, let's go Grand Prix racing. How do we do that? I'll tell you what we'll do. I'll put a team together. So I bought the race truck, the big caravan we had, bikes, and we got let down at the 11th hour with bikes. And Colin Appleyard stepped in and gave us 2 RS125s, and we went Grand Prix racing. Carol Nash paid the entry fee for IRTA, which then was $12,000, which was amazing. But I had to organise all this, obviously. And we had a great team of people. A guy, we had Mark, Simon Westwood, a guy called Dave Greenham, Trigger as he's known now. And we had a great little team, and we went off and did our bit, but it wasn't enough. So the next year, I decided I'd spend £35,000 on a HRC kit, which was useless. It was useless. It didn't do what we expected it to do, and it was not great. Neil's getting bigger, a bigger lad, and that's when we then did the 500 the following year in 95, and that was a huge success. Neil's riding in the top 10, finishing 20 seconds behind Mick Doohan. Wasn't bad.
It's not bad, really, is it?
Not bad.
On a factory Honda.
He was on a factory Honda. We were on a production 500 Yamaha. Halfway through the year, Kenny Roberts gave us better engines because we were on Dunlop tyres, and he wanted feedback from Neil about the tyres. So it kind of worked. But no, it was... So I think Neil will look now back and reflect and think, well, I didn't have to do those things, but I did. And I didn't do it for any commercial gain. I did it just because it was Neil,
It's an incredible story, and one that I'm very grateful to Neil for sharing the stories with us, because it's important for the dynamic with the two. You worked with many riders over the years, but quite synonymous with Neil and with JT as well. I'm conscious of time. I could sit here all afternoon and listen to the stories. It really is a privilege to sit with you. But two questions to finish off. What's your best memory? What gives you the most pride of everything you've done through racing or through looking after the riders that you have?
From a personal point of view, winning the Isle of Man TT. And I only won one TT because I didn't make the Isle of Man TT my career, as riders do. But that's such an achievement. I'm so proud of that. You get a bit of luck on the day, and I was probably Roger Marshall should have won that race, but he didn't. And when we talked at the beginning of this podcast about technical ability, mechanical technical ability, I won that race because of that. Because I never stretched my chain, and he did. Because every time we left the road, he kept the throttle open, and I neutralized the throttle by closing it and opening it again. There's two reasons for that. One is it doesn't stretch the chain. The other is when you keep the throttle open with the bike in the air, the gyroscopic effect turns the bike on the steering head because the bike's driven on the chain from one side. So if you suspended a bike in the air and revved it in gear, it would turn like that because the way that the chain drives, it would pull it round on the steering head. So you end up seeing riders getting all sorts of wobbles at the TT after jumps, and that's because they've got the throttle still open in the air and the bike's gone out of line. Anyway, there you go. So that was that. So he stretched the chain. But I felt sorry for him that he didn't win because he would have loved to have won a TT and he deserved to. But I think that's that moment. And it's been a proud moment to help with the experience that I had riders win world championships. The success that we had with Neil, the success with James was incredible. James was somebody that was like a machine. He was like the Iceman off Top Gun, He was a machine. And you could put James out anywhere and he believed that he was going to win. He believed in himself. He believed he was the best. It's just a shame at the end of James's career that my advice to him was be an actor, because his whole career was an act. When he was on the grid, it was an act. He wasn't that, he's such a lovely, kind person deep down, but that was a complete act that he put on. He could have been an amazing actor with the skills that he had. And of course, he could sing, so he could learn lines. Yeah. I couldn't be an actor because I couldn't remember the lines. I'd have to make it up.
Ad lib.
Yeah. So I think all those things. Any regrets? Probably not working hard enough. Other regrets may be sacrificing what would have been a normal family life, but would a normal family life suited me? Maybe not. I'm not sure. Maybe I'm not built for that. Maybe our DNA as racers and people in the paddock, that's our pride. That's what we love. It doesn't leave you. The passion doesn't leave you.
I can only imagine from a fan's point of view. I've said this on the podcast many a time. I'm a fan who got lucky.
Yeah.
But I've worked hard in manufacturing, and the opportunity came to work with OMG. The listeners and the viewers know the story, but the passion is what drives it along. And it was probably part of the reason my marriage failed, because I was always looking to do something within racing because I absolutely love it. And now we're fortunate enough to be able to sit here with you, looking out over Laceby Manor Spa and Resort for what you've achieved here.
I mean, some of the things that you remember, though, that you do for people. Neil Tuxworth, for example, had a life-threatening crash, and he was coming back from that crash physically. And Honda, in 1989, were looking to restart a race team. Honda Racing at Louth started in 1990. So in 1989, I was asked, who should we get to do the job? Probably I should have said at the time, I'll stop racing and I'll do it. But I didn't. I thought of two people. One was Charlie Williams, but Charlie Williams had a business. But I knew he was well organised and he could have done the job. Steve Parrish was already in racing, and he was
Loctite at that time?
Yeah, so he could have done the job. So I thought Neil would have been a great guy, Neil Tuxworth. So I said, no, let's Neil. So Bob McMillan at the time asked me to set a meeting up with Neil Tuxworth at Louth, and we did, and he got the job and sacked me immediately. I never rode for Honda in 1990, and I can't get my head around that.
What?
Really? No, I rode for Durex Suzuki in 1990 for Mick Grant's team.
Yeah, he did, yeah.
Because he sacked me. And he had Foggy and Whittam in 1990. And Whit, bless him, I think he totaled about 20 bikes that year, RC30s.
Yeah.
But anyway, so you look back at things, sometimes things backfire on you a bit, and you don't understand why. But anyway, c'est la vie.
That's an incredible story, and this is why we could sit and we were hoping to have Roger Marshall with us, but unfortunately he's busy. And with your appointment this afternoon, it's probably just as well, because we'd be here till the sun went down.
I'd love it.
We could make a series of this. So the final question. I ask this of every guest, especially for a first time that you've been on. What's your best hire car story, Roger?
Best hire car story? Best hire car story has to be with Steve Parrish. South Africa, Kyalami. Well, two with Steve Parrish, both with Steve Parrish, actually. I don't know which one's the worst. One was in Germany. We were going to the Hungaro Ring to World Superbike. He was running Terry Reimer, and I was travelling with Steve, although I wasn't riding for his team. And I've always been a friend of Steve's. He was great to me in my early Grand Prix career with the 500. He would pick me up and take me to Anderstorp and certain tracks to do the Grand Prix, although I'd done the European Championship by myself. So Steve's been a great friend. We're going through Germany, and he's got Penis, his number plate, Pen 15. And we get stopped by the police. And the first thing they ask for is your passports, of course. And then they ask him, was ist das? On the back parcel shelf of the car. And there was a gun on there. So he proceeded to open the door, get out, and he said, this, pointed at the policeman and squirted it, and it was a water pistol. So I thought, oh, what are you doing? Then we had to follow the policeman off the motorway to the station, where he had to prove that Pen 15 was a number that should have been on the car. Hours later, we get our passports back and we're on our way. So that was one, but probably not the worst one. We're in Kyalami. We pull up at some traffic lights, and he's again got the water pistol out, and he's put the window down on the passenger side, and he's squirting it out the passenger window at the driver of the car next to us at the traffic lights. And the driver pulls a proper gun and points it at us. And Stavros set off through these red lights, wheel spinning, and the guy chased us. And he was firing shots at us as he chased us, believe it or not. We ended up managing to lose him through Steve's excellent driving skills. But that was the most terrifying experience ever.
That's a story we've not had before. That's incredible. Normally, it's the access road for Cartagena, or the jumping out of the ramp at Daytona to land in the car park. That's an incredible.
Well,
story.
Steve did that as well, of course. He bent a car like a banana at Daytona, jumping onto the beach. Of course, he did.
Who else was telling me about? Jack Valentine. I think he's
put it
ended
all
up on
together
the
with
beach as well.
string. Put it all together with string and took the hire car back. I mean, Steve's hire car stories. I mean, he got banned from the BBC for hiring cars. So he would go across fields, grind the sump off a car, park it in the paddock, and ring the hire car company and said, the oil lights come on. Do you want me to leave the car here? And they'd say, oh, yeah, please leave the car with the keys. Great. He pressure washed the engine all down so there's no sign of oil, and just parked it there. Had the oil light come on? The sump was off it.
There's no oil, so it's going to come on. Yeah.
Great days.
Roger, thank you so much. This has been an absolute pleasure. I'd love to do this again when we've got a little bit more time, though, to know more about the TT and about the road racing side of it. We've barely scratched the surface from the racing side. And as we plan to do, and if he's not busy, we'll bring Reg in as well. And I'll just sit back and let you two talk, because I think the stories that we can bring to the viewers and to the listeners, for me, will be absolutely brilliant.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it. A pleasure. Thank you.
I'm glad. Thanks, Roger. Thank you so much.
Thank you.